I think we are live.
So I'm just gonna check. Yeah.
I want to watch it, but I can't.
You can go back to the Facebook page.
Right, on YouTube or Facebook, we just mute it, I guess, right?
I would be distracting.
No, follow everything.
Are there people coming in the room?
There are 69 people in the room. Welcome, folks.
And they're saying we're live on Zoom. We're live.
Yay.
This is very exciting.
It is.
It's always so fun to see like the room get bigger.
I know. It's awesome. There was one time where in the course that Britt and I were doing, she was letting people in and then there was a glitch. And so she was just like, yeah. Like she just kept, it sounded like, it was really weird. It freaked out. Like we were all like, okay, she can't, what's going on?
I'm just so excited.
Like a record that got.
Yeah, it was like a scratch. Like.
Right.
Okay, it's a thing.
All right, we are live. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Talking to Kids About Racism, Educators Edition. I just want to say for folks who are in the Zoom room, definitely use the chat or the Q&A, either one, and we'll be following that. Folks who are on Facebook, we're streaming on Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, LinkedIn. We're everywhere tonight, so you can find us in all those places. We think we have a way to see all of your comments in one place, but the Zoom link is on my Instagram page, Dr. Kira Banks, or on my Facebook page, Dr. Kira Banks. So if you prefer to be in the Zoom room, come on in. I want to just say welcome. I should say I'm Dr. Kira Banks, and that tonight we're being sponsored by the Metro East Montessori School. They have supported us in being able to have an expanded Zoom room, and so we appreciate their support. I mentioned to put your questions in the comments. We're going to spend probably the last 15 minutes or so answering your questions, so feel free to put those in. And if we can integrate them throughout our conversation, we will. If not, we'll turn our attention to those a little bit later. I want to briefly mention how tonight came about, just to say that in the first 2 episodes of Talking to Kids About Racism, which you can find on my Dr. Kira Banks page, a lot of questions came in from people in the education field. And it was just really clear to me that we needed a session focused on K through 12 educators. And so when I was feeling like, okay, we need to do this, I knew just the women to bring into this conversation. And so tonight we have 2 brilliant educators who bring decades of experience. And we have Britt Hawthorne, who's a nationally recognized equity trainer in education. She partners with action-oriented educators, creating classroom environments that are inclusive and equitable for all learners. And Tiffany Jewel, who's the author of This Book is Anti-Racist, an anti-racist educator, consultant, and mama. We both held up our books like, yes, it's so beautiful. So I want to just open up with throwing it to both of you to share kind of just, your philosophy, how you came to being an anti-bias, anti-racist educator, if that's how you identify. That's an acronym a lot of people use. So who wants to go first?
I'll go first. Okay, so yes, I'm Britt Hawthorne, pronoun she, her. And how did I become an anti-bias, anti-racist teacher educator? I would say my journey really started in 2016 through an organization called Montessori for Social Justice. And that was really what jump-started my work. I will say that I've always been raised in a very race-conscious household. I don't ever remember a time where we didn't discuss race, we didn't notice race, we didn't analyze who's in the room and who's not in the room. But I would say before 2016, a lot of my work lived in the world of diversity. And then after I went to Montessori for Social Justice in 2016 was wherein I started to really understand the language and the context that history gives us to understand today, and to really understand that our work lives and breathes in policy, and not in necessarily the day-to-day interactions of, if you're nice to me, I'll be nice to you, or peace, love, and all of that. So that's probably when I really started doing my work.
Yeah, similar story. But also I've been a Montessori educator for 15 years and worked with young folks for 18. And the goals of anti-bias education have always been there. And when I started learning about the framework for anti-bias education, it gave me the language to better explain what I was doing with my students and the children I worked with. And it really was, Montessori for Social Justice was the first organization that like accepted my workshop proposal for me to like present at a conference. And it really was, I remember the first workshop, we were in Boston, and like I had my 3-month-old baby like attached to me the whole time. And the workshop was like building an anti-racist curriculum in the classroom. And it was like no one else, all the other conferences and stuff didn't want to touch that. And it really was this like small community within the larger Montessori community that really kind of like supported this work and boosted us and amplified folks like me who have been doing it and providing like platform and, you know, like kind of like the credentials behind your back that are needed in white supremacy culture that we live in. So that's, yeah. I love that our stories are so similar. And also Montessori for Social Justice is how we met you too, Kira. So
yes, that's true. That's how I came to know you both and your great work. I mean, and it's interesting you mentioned that as a teacher, as an educator, you were working on building a curriculum that was responsive. And I remember when I had the first school that I worked with, and they were like, we want to get started on being anti-bias, anti-racist. And so we're going to buy this curriculum. And I remember saying, like, don't do that. So I'm leading into this question of where do people start? So this, and I would say for educators and for schools. So for schools, my advice always is don't just go buy something off the shelf, because like, are your teachers prepared to deliver that? Is your school ready to hold that? And so that's been my thought of like thinking about creating an environment that can hold the anti-bias, anti-racist curriculum you want to deliver. But what do you all think? What do you tell people when they're like, where do I start on this journey?
Tiffany, I'll let you go first.
The same. We're kind of dealing with that in our district right now. They're really quickly wanting to adopt anti-bias, anti-racist lessons. So teachers can pick some lessons. And my first thought is like, whoa, we need to like pause that, because we can't have teachers like imparting these lessons without understanding the framework, without doing the work on their own to really understand. You know, I love anti-bias education because it has goals for adults. So the adults are doing work right alongside with the children. And I always think like, if you're going to adopt a curriculum without doing any of that internal work and without having the full like support as you go on, that work can actually do more harm than not doing it at all. Because, well, for many reasons, you know, a lot of our schools have a lot of white teachers who are just waking up right now and who are needing to unpack and understand their own identities before doing that work with their students. So it's a little like, I know there's a sense of urgency, especially right now, but really hoping that all schools and school districts will support the teachers before pushing it onto the students.
And Tiffany, you had a really good on Instagram. You were saying how right now a lot of people are jumping to consume, and that quantity over quality of just wanting to consume books and wanting to consume just so much to have, right? To like to build an entire anti-racist bookshelf based off of, you know, top 25 books.
So many lists right now.
And then when you're consuming that, like you then become overwhelmed. Now you have all of these books and you don't even know where to start.
Yeah. And there's also, there's the consumption part. And then there's also like, I love Teaching Tolerance. They offer curriculum for free. And so what we have in the area where I am, a lot of schools are like quick to jump on that because they're like, it's free, like, and they're not doing the work of like calling Teaching Tolerance and being like, hey, we need one of your trainings first. We're going to like Crossroads Anti-Racism or People's Institute or Recenter, like any of organizations for the whole district to understand what systemic racism is before they're even doing that work. So teaching tolerance is great, but we need to do more before that.
Yeah. And I just want to back up because someone in the chat had asked, well, can you tell us more about the framework? And, we're steeped in the work. So I'm going to take a stab and you all share, your thoughts. I mean, I think about anti-bias, anti-racism as a framework for education, that it's not just about how you teach the child. Like Tiffany said, it's also about the adult and the educator and the environment, and making sure that the environment is free of bias, of assumptions, and is acknowledging the fact that systemic oppression exists in our society and is willing to work to interrupt that actively. So an anti-bias, anti-racist school doesn't mean that bias and racism never happens.
Right.
It means that it's working and trying to cultivate an environment that is dismantling and interrupting. What would you all say?
And really, when you become an anti-biased educator, I'll keep always using that word becoming as this active verb.
Yes.
You are in fact acknowledging, saying we live in a biased society, we live in a racist society. And therefore, because my classroom is a microcosm of what's happening in the macro world, it also shows up in my classroom. The power dynamics show up in my classroom. My learners, in fact, have personal and social identities. And so, like for me, when people say, where does the work start? It always starts with relationship. It always starts in community. And so thinking about, and it doesn't have to be a large community. It could be just 3 teachers, 3 educators. I use that term very inclusive with educators. It could be caregivers, admin, leadership that says, we want to have a community. And so, because that is really the goal of anti-bias, anti-racism, is that it will not only humanize all of us, right? It's going to build relationships with all of us and will build accountability. So you really have to start in community, which I know is hard because it's hard to be vulnerable, to say, I didn't know that I was unintentionally perpetuating white supremacy culture. But you start there, and then within your community, the next step really is to think about outcomes. Because that's the other thing about anti-racist work. Anti-racist work is outcome-based work. It's saying that we are seeking to change or to continue or to disrupt or to create positive X, Y, and Z. And from those outcomes, then you have the conversation of, okay, well, where do we have challenges? Challenges could be resistant people. It could be unconscious people. It could be a lack of financial resources or time or whatever have you. You also think about, well, what support do we have? And again, all those things I just said for challenges might be support. And then from there, you create an action. But oftentimes a pitfall will be a lot of people want to jump to action, right? Like, and I will ask folks, I say, have you ever participated in anti-bias, anti-racist work before? And they'll say, yes. And I'm like, great, tell me about it. And they're like, we read White Fragility. And I'm like, seeking to create what outcome? And then they're like, oh, and I'm like, yes. So, you really have to view community, outcomes, and then becomes the action. And really the last piece, and I know that's very hard. I'm a former classroom teacher myself. I know it's very hard because we want to immediately do this work for learners instead of saying, no, I'm going to do this work for myself. And in turn, I do it with my learners.
Yeah.
And so it's such a paradigm shift.
Yeah. And I love the framework that Dr. Barbara J. Love presents in like a very accessible article called Developing a Liberatory Consciousness. And she just kind of walks us through 4 steps of awareness, analysis, action, and accountability. And I often talk about how right now, I feel like a lot of people are in that like awareness and analysis phase. Like, oh my gosh, racism is this thing. And now I'm going to start analyzing it by reading all of these texts. And we get so comfortable in the spaces of our personal growth. And it really is like the action and accountability where we take ourselves out and we're uncomfortable, but we're also like working in community. That's why the relationships are so important, because we can't, I don't feel like we can have really concrete actions without our communities behind us. And I can put the article in the chat too. It's Developing a Liberatory Consciousness from Dr. Barbara J. Love. It's so accessible. Like I think.
And just kind of going back to what Tiffany was saying is that when you skip over analysis, then harm will happen,
Yeah.
right? And so, and oftentimes we will, like, we build awareness and then we just want to do something, but we haven't spent that time. And I often think about how I used to teach Brown versus Board of Education when I was in the classroom, because I didn't spend the time in the analysis to learn the story myself. And the way that I told the story, and the way that most educators today tell the story, so I'm not alone, is that we continue to perpetuate this inferiority when it comes to children of color, particularly Black children, in the classroom, telling a story of your school wasn't as good as the white school, and so we needed to integrate it.
Yeah.
And, you know, instead of going back to those primary sources where you have, or even like I remember asking my grandmother was like, I loved my school. I loved my teacher. And she never experienced integrated school. She only ever experienced segregated school. And she's like, I wish my grandchild, my granddaughter could have Black teachers like I did.
Yeah.
Right. And those teachers loved the children, didn't see them as deficient.
Right.
I think that's something that I've seen. Schools that think that they're doing something about racism will say, well, we're trying to address the achievement gap, or we're trying to address the opportunity gap. And so I want you to talk about that terminology and that phrasing. My sense is that it's leading people down a deficit narrative or deficit framework of, like you said, these kids who need to be fixed or helped.
Yeah. And I also like that kind of language, that deficit language, and just like parsing children out by statistics, you know, by their ELA scores or their math scores, or what they can do compared to other kids and what they can't do. Like it dehumanizes them. Like they don't get to be whole people who have full lives in their own communities. And when we talk about, we use, you know, language like minorities coming from disadvantaged homes, like there's already that bias. And so teachers are already going to like lower standards for them, have kind of whatever biases they've built up over their many years of living. And, you know, I think so many of our districts, I know ours is still trying to like close that gap, instead of looking at like, and I love how Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about like the education debt. Like it's actually like we owe our students a whole lot more than thinking that they're nothing.
I'd say, so Tiffany, I texted you an article. I don't know if you can access it and then share it in the chat box, because I'm on the struggle bus with technology today, but there's a great article with, there's an interview with Gloria Ladson-Billings where the entire article is centered around the education debt and how she and Gloria Ladson-Billings coined this term of the education debt. Because again, going back to anti-racist work, is that we are constantly system blaming and we are not person blaming.
Yeah.
And so when we use language like achievement gap or even opportunity gap, that's still blaming the individual. And it's still saying, and I'll hear educators, and I've done this myself, where we want our children of color or any of our children that hold a marginalized identity to perform at the level of the children of the dominant identity. And by us saying that we want them to perform at that level without considering the ways in which the child of the dominant identity experiences privileges, or as Dr. Nolan, is it
Cabrera?
Thank you. Cabrera says immunity, or the ways in which they're just enabled, right? They're just enabled by receiving psychological privileges and resources and classrooms and advantages in the classroom. So even that like education, that achievement and opportunity, it's still person blaming the child and the family and the community without saying, okay, well, are the teachers, do they have X amount of years of experience teaching? Do they have a master's degree or continuing ed in this field? Are they even trained in this field? How much is the school receiving? How much is the PTO bringing in? Because a lot of money gets hidden in PTOs and schools. I mean, I have worked at a school where an entire ancillary department is subsidized by a PTO.
Wow.
And so like, those are things when we say that it's an education debt and it's something that is owed to these children, really shifts the way that we can have a conversation too.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, important that when we talk about like, how do people get started? Because people always ask, what's the first step? I think from what I'm hearing you all say, and it aligns with how I see things, you need to understand the history of how the system of education really does owe a debt to students of color, and has marginalized them in very systematic ways. And then be clear about how that's happening in your district, in your school, in your classroom. And that part of being an anti-bias, anti-racist educator is being in constant, Freire would talk about, action praxis, like constant reflection and practice and action and back and forth. It's iterative. You're like you said, Britt, you're constantly becoming. It requires that, and it requires that, which I think it's vulnerable. It requires humility. It requires saying you don't know. And that is not a posture that a lot of teachers are comfortable taking. Like, how do you...
Especially when you feel like you are constantly under attack by the larger community. It is always like our schools are failing, which essentially you're saying educators are failing, which by the way, any educator listening to this, I don't think you're failing at all. But you are, so you have not only this guard up, but you're also operating out of a very insecure space because you feel like you always have to prove something. So it is hard to try and tell your coworkers in the way in which what you didn't know. And, for most of us, like myself, I went to public school my whole life. I K-12. And I'm teaching many of the same things, many of the same concepts that were taught to me. Yeah. And so, at what point are we going to break the cycle? At what point are we going to change the curriculum? But that's going to take a lot of humility for teachers, for educators to say, I have been doing this wrong. I am perpetuating white supremacy within my classroom, and anti-Blackness within my classroom. I'm also affording children with dominant identities, white children, privileges in my classroom, either at this point intentionally or unintentionally. But it does take a lot of humility.
It does. Can you all give some examples? So I imagine I know because I had a lot of DMs, people are excited and literally sitting at like the fountain of what you were saying to get your wisdom. But I know that there are also some people that are like, what? I don't perpetuate white supremacy in my classroom. Can you give some examples of what that looks like that people might not have really recognized or reflected on as perpetuating inequity?
Yeah, it looks like teachers still teaching books like Indian in the Cupboard and not thinking there's anything wrong with that. And it's continuing in this, continuing to teach to the standardized test and just teaching a one-sided history that is written by Eurocentric, where we don't even get to talk about, I think of my AP American history course should have been very expansive, and whose story was missing from that. All of the indigenous folks, we learned about them in a very specific time period, and then nothing else after the Trail of Tears, almost like they were disappeared, and they didn't. They're still very much alive. About the US's just colonialism and the parts that we've played in dominating countries like the Philippines and Hawaii. We don't even learn, we learn Hawaii becomes a state, but we don't learn about the history of Hawaii before that.
And that was a great thing. It was a great thing for them that we let them into the United States.
Yeah, and it wasn't. We don't learn about how the United States border kept pushing into Mexico. And we don't learn, we don't learn about all the broken peace treaties and the broken deals. We don't learn about how we played a part in the demise of the first Black Republic in Haiti, in Cuba. We just don't learn about those things. And by kind of just going with how we've always done things is which most of I know I was a big part of that, in my early teaching career too, just being like, oh, I'm just going to teach this one-sided story of history, and look at all these European accomplishments. Aren't they great?
And never telling the stories of resistance, of how
right.
Particularly enslaved folks had always resisted the rebellions, and having an emphasis on that. And whether it's a large documented rebellion, or even if it was a smaller rebellion, in the sense of how they would hide the farm tools as an act of resistance to not have to work, or telling the stories. And now I forget what university is compiling that list of the ads of runaway enslaved folks. But there's there's a university that is compiling, and I want to say that they have reached over 1,000. So we know, like, there was always this active resistance of people trying to escape. And a very common question that will happen in the early grades is, why didn't they just run away? Why didn't they just fight back? I would never let someone do that to me, right? And so oftentimes what can get told is, well, that's the way it was. And, and later on, and we had a war that only white people fought in for Black people's freedom. Mm-hmm. And then we had this man named Abraham Lincoln that saved the day. Like, did not at all say, sweetheart, actually they did resist. They resisted every
day.
Yeah.
Every day they resisted. I was reading Nat Turner's story.
Yeah.
And his mother, as an act of resistance, actually tried to murder him before he was born, so that she could protect him from slavery. And then also understanding that for their religious or their spiritual beliefs, that life and death was very fluid as well, not binary, where some of us who are coming maybe from a Western ideology of life and death are coming from. And so, but like, those are even ways, and again, how we perpetuate. And I think there's two different things that are going on, right? There's the ideology of white supremacy, saying that whiteness is inherently good, it's inherently right, and it's inherently the best or superior standard. And so we see that when we think of, if we're constantly putting whiteness as the standard and not naming it as whiteness. So then we have that, and then we have like those traits of white supremacy culture that show up within our own classroom philosophy and our teaching and what we allow to live and breathe in our classroom. If I think that I'm being successful today because we got through a whole bunch of work, regardless if the learners engaged with the work or understood the work, but I got to check off my lesson plan. So I engaged in quantity versus quality.
Right.
If a learner called me out and, I'm in the hallway and I stop and I chit chat with, Bev, and a learner says, I don't think that's fair that teachers get to talk, but we can't. And I shut it down. Like, how dare you question me? That was very important in what I had to say, which it really wasn't. But, and I shut it down. And then there's that sense of defensiveness.
Right.
And so all of these traits, we not only are perpetuating, but the children themselves are internalizing of, this is what it means to be an adult and to be right, and to not only hold power, but there's a whole nother conversation with classroom management of misuse of power.
Yes. These are all really good examples. And I should say, for folks who are watching in some other streaming form, there are some articles that have been put in the Zoom chat. So you're welcome to come into the Zoom room. I mentioned the link is on my Dr. Kira Banks page on Instagram. Come into the Zoom room. I'll stop being cheesy. But I will also attempt to collect these resources and put them in the show notes, so that when you go back to watch the live stream, they'll be there, at least on Facebook. Yeah. All right. So I want to get to a couple other topics, and I want us to keep flowing, but I want to just name that Tiffany has a really great book. Just want to make sure that we let everyone know about this book. A book is Anti-Racist, and it's great. I love it, and it's beautiful. Like, the illustrations are so colorful and gorgeous.
Oh, that's my favorite one too.
Yeah,
one of my favorites.
They're just so great. So Aurelia Durand is the artist.
Yeah,
Durand is the artist, and so I wanted to just give you a chance to talk a little bit about the book and like the birth of the book. But for those of you who hopefully you've been able to get your hands on it, because I know it's been hard. There's been, like you said, people are consuming and wanting to like collect books. But what I love is that it reads like a graphic novel in a sense, but also like a in some ways like a journal. And I imagine that it feels very accessible. So I'm curious what made you write this type of book, and what's the response been?
The response has been great. Last night we found out it's a New York Times bestseller.
Congratulations.
Yeah. And it's like #1, which is like, I don't even know what to do with that.
Celebrate.
Yeah. I know. We ate chocolate cake today. Yeah. So that book, like birds, it came out of the work that I did with my students, with 6 to 9-year-olds. We did this history of racism and anti-racism and resistance in my classroom. And I taught 6 to 9-year-olds in a Montessori school, and we would do this. And it kind of started with like me as the teacher telling the story, and it started with enslavement and it ended with Obama, and then like the kids are like, we actually need more of this, and it turned into this like kind of whole year-long thing where we started with really diving deeply into our identity, and we would build identity maps and like keep building on them throughout the school year and see what stays the same and what changes. In the book, an editor from my publisher contacted me because she followed me on Instagram, and was like, have you ever thought of writing a book? And this is kind of what came out of it. And really like wanting it to be a book for young folks, thinking of like myself when I was like 9 and 14, and I was like witnessing these things and experiencing them, but I didn't have the language to talk about it, and I didn't know what to do. And I definitely didn't have the knowledge of history behind me. So wanting to put a little bit of all of that into a book, so kids would come out of it having this like knowledge and being empowered to be able to like stand up to racism. One of the things I often hear from like young folks is, how do I talk to my parents about this? Or I think racism is something we should be dealing with, and my parents don't want to deal with it. And giving them not just like language to talk about it, but also letting them know they're not alone. And now like schools are using it in their curriculum. A lot of teachers are reading it to dive in. And I'm really hoping like it can be a book that really jumpstarts this big deep dive into racial equity and resistance in our schools and in our homes. And it doesn't just have to be like about history, but you can do like, there's writing prompts. There's like there's statistics in there. I want you to know like numbers, because numbers are very important when you're trying to like explain to somebody what's happening and why something's happening. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's beautiful. And
Thank you.
what I love about it is that oftentimes when people talk about ABAR work, they think about like, what do I need to do for someone else? Like, and we want to think about how we spend our privilege, leverage our privilege, all of that. And that's in the book as well. But what I love is that it starts with self and self-exploration. Yeah. And that's what I hope people get from all of what the awakening that's happening right now. Like, yes, like Britt said, we need to work in community to dismantle systems of oppression. And that requires a deep level of self-reflection and awareness.
Yeah.
So it's beautiful. And that's where you start as you bring the journey.
And I was really also looking at the framework of anti-bias education and Dr. Barbara Love's framework to help guide this conversation in the book with young folks. Like really, like it didn't just like come out of nowhere, but very purposeful. And like the first school of anti-bias education is like, you know who you are, you know yourself, and you love yourself. And that's where we start in the book too.
Yeah.
I'm actually using the book right now. Well, we just finished it, but my 13-year-old we went through the book. And so we actually just finished all of the activities. And I can't wait. And so what we did was I bought him a special notebook he picked out, and he did all the activities. And it was really interesting to see him go back. Sometimes I'd say, okay, like what's the activity today that Tiffany has for us? And he's like, hang on, I have to go back and I have to add some to the stereotype list. And I'm like, okay. And so he's adding. And so like, I'm really excited to see how he's going to evolve with the book, because I think it's something that you can revisit with young ones year after year. And if you keep their information in a notebook or in a journal, for them to even see how they have evolved over time and what they used to think or how they used to feel about themselves versus others.
That's great. And how old is your little one? I shouldn't say little one.
I'm using it with the older one. He's 13.
Okay, so my oldest is 13. Okay, all right.
Yes. Yep. So I went through and like Tiffany said, it's really nice because we were using the 4 goals of anti-bias education. And I felt like this just took it up a notch of you start with self, him loving on himself, but then him also being aware of who he is by understanding who he's not. The one we did have to revisit the one about what would you do after the nationalizing of the murder of George Floyd, the question about what would you do if you saw the police, and we revisited that one because he had this really inspirational, grand response when he originally did it. And then after the nationalizing of George Floyd, he said, I don't know if I really would go up to the police officer and say something. And him now being aware of I'm a Black man. Like, what can I do? And him really also acknowledging the young woman who reported it for the entire time. He felt like she was a hero. He was like, that was really brave of her because that was really scary.
Huh. And what I love about that story, and I hope people get, is like, these are ongoing conversations. So people often ask me, when do you start talking to your kids about racism? How do you do it? And you do it early and often. It's ongoing. Yeah. It's just like, I sometimes give the analogy because I think it helps people get it who haven't yet taken the leap to have these conversations of like sex. You don't sit your kid down and talk to them about everything about sex once and you're done, right?
Like, hopefully not.
Although that's how some people historically did it. We're not doing that anymore, right? But how do you do that over time? Layer age-appropriate content, but revisit things, right? Like, so when your kid's little and you talk about consent, you help them know body autonomy. If you don't want me to tickle you and you say stop, I stop because that's your body, right? You're laying the groundwork for consent there. And so this book is anti-racist. This book is great because you can talk to your child about who they are, right? And their identities before you layer on oppression and right like that. And so for folks to hear that, like when you think about the students in your classroom, because one of the questions I want to ask you is someone asked is how can teachers and schools best support Black and Indigenous students of color in majority white spaces and predominantly white schools, right? Like my hunch is you'll probably say something about like affirming who they are because that's so essential. So what advice would you give teachers who are in predominantly white spaces? How do you support the Black and Indigenous students of color?
Yeah, my hope, because I taught in a very predominantly white school, is that there is some teacher there who's also Black Indigenous person of the global majority. And I was often that teacher, and like it was really important for me and those kids in any grade to connect. But definitely like firming identity and then not dwelling in the oppression. And really experience, like all children want to read books about joy, and they want to read books about resistance and strong people and heroes, for lack of a better word. And like in my class of predominantly white kids, like almost all of the books we read were by Black and Brown and Indigenous authors. And every white child in my class could see themselves in that book. And all of my Black and Brown students could see themselves too, when maybe they wouldn't have in a different classroom in a different school if their teacher wasn't conscious of that. And I think it's really knowing that when we affirm just like the one, like there has been just like one brown kid in the class too, affirming them will help us to affirm everybody. And really also not singling them out and expecting them to represent all people of the global majority.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. Everything Tiffany said, it is so important that all children understand they come from a place of power before discussing the oppression that their community experienced. And so really looking at the stories that we're telling, the books that we have, on the shelves, but also being really frank with the families, having conversations with families and saying, I'm noticing that your child is the only one or a handful of children of color. I want to acknowledge that. And I also want to partner with you to make sure that your child continuously feels affirmed in this classroom. Get ahead of it. Use research to say, not only am I noticing, but your child is also noticing too. Again, use the power of research that's there, because sometimes families, adults, caregivers won't know. They'll say, well, I don't think it affects my child. And we can say, actually, what we do know is that if they're not experiencing harmony within their identity, that it is affecting them. And these are the ways that it can. And so, but we can work together to make sure your child feels empowered. Is there a particular way in which, if there's a different home language that we can say good morning, we can say thank you, we can say goodbye. And you just make it a part of the culture. It's not something that's on the side, or we do it on Thursday at 11 o'clock, but it becomes so normalized in the culture. And so the family partnership is crucial in helping that child. You can't do it oftentimes. A pitfall I will see is a teacher might feel very comfortable with that child and talking through the child, but not comfortable yet with the adults. And it goes back to kind of that protest sign. If anyone has ever seen the protest signs, and it says, at what point do I move from being acute to becoming a threat? And often if we haven't reckoned with our own implicit bias of, this child's very cute, I can have a conversation with this child, but I don't feel comfortable to have the conversation with the adult. That's something where, again, in community, find the folks that will hold you accountable so you can do that.
That's so real. I really appreciate you saying that, because I know that, I've experienced that as a mom of Black boys in particular, of like teachers not being able to have the conversation with me. And so it's like, that how do they work through being able to talk about race, talk about my child's experience of race with me, right? Then it's so important to do that work. What about, so there was a question about how to support Black and Indigenous people of global majority teachers who are in probably white spaces. Were you all in those situations? Were you in schools where you were like one of few?
Yes.
both schools I taught at, yes.
Yeah.
The first school I taught at, I was the only lead Black teacher. And I want to say I was the only lead teacher of color at the school. And again, it's going back to that history of Brown versus Board of Education, knowing that in the 11 years after Brown versus Board of Education, more than 38,000 teachers were systematically fired based off of that ideology of inferiority. So I understand the context of why, and we've never fully recovered from that. But oftentimes when you're dealing with adults, my number one response to that is go ask them.
Yep.
Go, we don't have to like guess or like try to create a committee. It's like, go ask them. I think the white folks oftentimes have to hold themselves accountable. There's actually a webinar going on for my Patreon community right now called Decentering Whiteness, in which white folks are working through how to hold themselves accountable, how to create boundaries and expectations, and then how do they call each other in or call each other out when they've said something rooted in racism, when they've said something that's harmful or problematic or dismissive, because that's a lot of work that white folks have to do. And with educators being 82 white, public school K-12, I think it's 80, I know it's in the 80%. It's a lot of work white folks have to do within that.
Yeah. And so as we're having this conversation, I had a question to ask you, Britt, like, where did your I'm rooting for you campaign come from? But it seems so clear.
Yes, because I am literally rooting for you, Dr. Kira Banks, and you, Tiffany Jewel, and everyone else that's watching, because I know it goes back to that quote of, and who, please remind me, because I'm probably going to get the name wrong. But my liberation and also my oppression, my experience is bound up with yours too, right? So I have to root for you, and I want to see you succeed in anti-bias, anti-racist work. because it will make a stronger community. It will make us accountable. It will humanize us. I, in turn, will benefit from that. Lila Watson, thank you. And you will benefit from it as well. And so, and again, I mean, I did not go to like some special school. I didn't have like an uber woke family by any means. I am also aggressively unlearning information that I've consumed, I've ingested myself. And so I have a lot of grace for myself and for other educators. And I also have a lot of challenges for myself and other educators to say, we, in fact, it is our work, it is our responsibility to do this work. And so on Instagram, just a few years ago, I would kind of have this like educational series of where it was a Failure Friday, what I would share about how I unintentionally perpetuated white supremacy in my classroom. Mm-hmm. And then what I decided to change in my classroom, what people will see, the change in my teaching practice. And at the end, I used to always just end with like, I'm rooting for you. And it caught on. And then folks would like send me messages. And because I would say, today I'm going to have a conversation about Indian boarding schools and the harm in which education has been weaponized against communities. Today's going to be a tough conversation, a tough lesson. And folks would say, I'm rooting for you. And I'm like, oh, thank you.
My students would ask me to wear like my rooting for you sweatshirt. I had the sweatshirt and they loved it. And, if it was like a kind of a hard week, they'd be like, tomorrow, can you wear the rooting for you sweatshirt? Hi, Kobe.
Oh, how sweet.
He's in his swim trunks in case anybody wants to know. They just came back from the pool.
I'm glad he got to go experience that joy. Yeah, I mean, that's beautiful though, that you're modeling failing. Like, I love that. And that's something that I've seen. I've been doing, I have some schools I've been working with, but have most of my clients right now are in the corporate spaces, and they want to act like they know it all. They want to feel like they know it all. And one thing I feel like slightly the pandemic has forced many people, most of us, to admit that like we don't have it all figured out as we try to figure it out. And I want to ask this question. Someone asked specifically with remote learning, like, how do teachers build relationships rooted in love and joy? Like this, I'm rooting for you culture. Like, how do you do that online? How do you cultivate that online? Do you have suggestions? Because I know that some schools are talking about coming back, but others aren't. Like, how do you do that? Any suggestions for teachers as they move into this new school year that very well might be online?
Yeah, our middle school teacher at our school did a beautiful job of just kind of like keeping the community open. So he had like just lunches, and he would just like keep his computer open and he'd sit and eat lunch with the kids, or like leave the Zoom link open for them all too. So that was like a really, really important and awesome way to share community with everybody. And then he also, and then the younger folks, they just kept, I'm like seeing the chat, like, thank you, Carlos, you can move on now. I'm sorry you feel this way. But I think one of the important things is for teachers to not try to go back to like, we need to like keep our schedule and do the status quo of what we've always done. But we need to like relearn how to be in a community together. We need to like go back and spend our time building community, whether it's like sharing stories together, keeping our lunches open, whatever it is, just having those moments where you're like recentering yourself. And that's going to need to keep happening too.
Yeah. And I will say, I am not at all by any means an expert about virtual learning. And so the suggestions that I will give are going to be, I've been doing virtual learning for some time now with adults. And what I realized is, and what Tiffany, I think she does really well when we do virtual webinars together, is going back to having some agreements around taking care of yourself, taking care of others, and taking care of the environment. And by being able to say, we trust you. So what does that mean about your mic? Or what does that mean with your camera on and off? making sure that we are thinking about if learners need to go to the bathroom, can we record the video so they can watch it later on to say, it's okay if you've missed something, you can come back and you can watch it. Definitely a lot of community building. Something I have seen from a teacher out of California, their name is Sky Tooley, and their Instagram account is at Growing with Mixed Teeth.
Yeah.
I think I said, right? But something that they're doing really well is creating a Google form. And it's a mental check-in that they do, a mental health check-in. I think it's every Friday. And there's just a series of questions. How are you feeling physically, emotionally, academically, but also checking in, being very, very aware of population, checking in with, do you feel safe at home? Are there arguments that are happening at home? There's a lot of things where in the classroom, we're all mandated reporters. And so we could pick up on things, but we're not in the classroom anymore. And then also having those office hour times where when can we check in with the learners one-on-one, even if it's, and it doesn't have to be on a screen, even if it's the good old telephone and you just call a child up and you let them know, I'm going to call you and the conversation is going to be 5 minutes. And playing games can be a lot of fun if you have younger learners calling them, playing I Spy, I spy with my little eye, the sound, and the learners have to tell you what in their environment has the sound, like pillow or pink. And so like thinking about just those old school games that we can do virtually that will continue to build community.
Yeah. And I know my own children loved talking to their teachers on the phone, and they're 4 and 8. And it was so sweet. And then teachers also arranging, like my 8-year-old's teacher also like would arrange just these like small groups, and you can hop in like open office hours, and kids would like play songs to each other, or she'd send them on a scavenger hunt. And it was all about building community. It wasn't about like, here's your math lesson, here's this. It was, yeah.
And I was going to say, I would like to see, and I'm not saying this because I haven't seen, but I would like to see a lot of upper elementary, middle school, and high school educators really creating a space, allowing there to be a Google Meet time for learners to meet, not for academics, but continue the advisory. What I have heard a lot of, if you have that homeroom advisory advocacy hour, a lot of times that got cut during virtual learning, bringing that back, because we know that is the most social time of their life. And they are dependent on their social relationships, not so much with the adult, but more peer-to-peer. So how can we create a community meeting time, or they can meet on their own and you let them meet via Google Meet, or you meet with them.
Those are great examples. I hope that folks are able to incorporate some of that. And it's going to be necessary. Yeah. And
it's also one of the things is not just the teacher being that person, but having other folks in the school, the head of school, the principal, the counselors, like taking on and holding some of those moments too, where they are building community, can be really powerful.
Yeah. There were a number of questions that were asking about, where do you start first? Teachers, school, and I think that you always want it to be a both and. If you can have the system, so the school as a system, the district as a system, support the work, I think that makes it easier on the lone teacher. But what Britt said way back at the beginning about community is essential. So if you don't have that support of the school, of the system, of the district in that way, you can do it with just a handful of other teachers in your discipline, maybe even not at your school, or at your school, to not feel like you have to wait for the school to get on board for you to start to enact some of these practices.
Yeah, because the school board is going to be much slower at it.
Although there are a lot of open doors right now. Like there are a lot of teams that are organizing, like, we didn't do standardized tests last year. Maybe we don't do that anymore. And we're changing everything. Let's consider this change.
Yeah.
So, yeah. In our last few minutes, I want to give you a chance if there's other things that you wanted to share with folks to be able to share, but then also ask you this last question and for you to be able to share about yourself and how folks can follow you and find you, because there's so many questions that we didn't get to. Folks want to hear more from you. So my question is, how do you continue to resource yourself in the midst of everything that's going on? So to share a little bit about how you stay in touch with your own joy and resilience. And then in that, if you'll also let folks know if they want to follow you, where they can find you.
Tiffany?
Well, I think for one of the things that I've just started yesterday was I took a break from social media. And that was really like, it felt like breathing again. Because I was getting so caught up and doing so much work and like educating other people that I wasn't able to like catch in and check in with myself. So I'm spending a lot more time over on my Patreon community, and I'll put it in the chat box. You can find me at Anti-Bias Montessori Patreon community. And that's where I'm like sharing all of my joy and a whole bunch of other stuff. And another thing that I've like really been enjoying lately is Britt and I have been doing a lot of work together. And we just finished our first cohort of co-creating classroom community with our friend Trisha McKeno, who is also an elementary Montessori educator. And we spent three Sunday afternoons working with 100 educators, really kind of going back to like redefining classroom management, because it's really about building community instead of managing little bodies. And that, like, I found a lot of joy in that. And we still have some open spots in our next cohort in July, co-creating classroom community. And Britt and I also have a bunch of other things coming up too.
We have an anti-racist parenting course that we're launching mid-July, and will run through mid-August. And so we are going to be discussing, both of us have been intentional anti-racist parents for the last several years now. And so it's a introductory course, but it's those fundamentals of I'm looking to also raise my children to become anti-racist, and I'm becoming anti-racist. And so we'll definitely share it both on our Patreons. And I'll just say, you can follow me on Patreon. Honestly, I try to streamline all of my information there. And I am on a social media break right now. I'm supposed to start back tomorrow, and I'm not ready. And I hear Tiffany, like, take care. So I may continue it. But I do have to say, something that sustains me and does fill me with, that refills me, is to continue to do ABAR work. It's like a muscle. And so the more I do it, the more not only am I becoming healed from the ways in which I've experienced white supremacy, but it also energizes me. And also doing it with folks like you, Dr. Kira Banks and Tiffany, who just pour into me and heal me. So I would say, and I drink a lot of good coffee.
A lot of coffee?
Yeah, Kobe just said a lot, like every single day.
I would have to be honest and say it's tequila for me, but coffee works too. I don't do caffeine, but so I have been using that analogy as well. And I think it's because for me, I like different challenges at different points in my life. And at this chapter, it's been lifting weights. And so like, there've been a lot of I've been using the hashtag gym lessons, life lessons of like, to build muscle. It's hard. It's uncomfortable. You're actually tearing down to build up. Yeah. And you can want to get strong, but just because you want to doesn't make it happen. And you can go lift a heavy weight once, and that doesn't build your muscles. So it's like with that, we would never expect gains unless we did something consistently over time, right? And with anti-bias, anti-racist work, I see people want to like microwave cook it. Yeah. And so I want people to realize that it really is like lifting weights. It's a discipline and it takes time. I really appreciate you all sharing your time. I know that it's precious. I want to remind folks, I've already seen people who've signed up for your Patreon communities. Yay. And I want you to do that, because I want you to continue to learn from these women and their amazing work, and to support them for that. I also want to make sure I say that Metro East Montessori supported the expansion of our Zoom room and our webinar capacity. And so I want to say thank you to Metro East Montessori School. And if you want to support the work of Raising Equity, you can go to our website, raisingequity.org, and there's a donate button there. And I just,
is that, so they're donate at raisingequity.org. But do you have any, I feel like you do a lot, but do you have any new offerings coming out?
So right now, people can follow me I'm Dr. Kira Banks on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and is that everything? And I'm Kira Banks on LinkedIn. I'm Kira Banks on Twitter. And right now, I don't have anything that's like coming out. I have some curriculum that has been mostly going to schools that are buying the curriculum around talking to your kids about race and racism, talking to your kids about gender and sexism and homophobia and sexual orientation, as like a parent community might buy the course and go through that together. But I want to just highlight you all tonight because that is what is important. But I appreciate that. Britt's always like support. She's rooting for me. She's rooting for you too.
Yeah.
I mean, you're like my number one. When someone reaches out to me, they think they need me, but they just need directions. And I'm like, oh, you really are looking for someone to work with administration, leadership, you're looking for a strategic planner, or you're looking for some organizational work. I just work with classroom I won't say just, but I work with classroom educators.
Right.
Then you're my number one. That I'm like, oh, it really sounds like you need Dr. Kira Banks.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
When people ask me to work with teachers, I'm like, no, you really need Britt Hawthorne, Tiffany Jewel. Like there are people who do that and who've been classroom educators. And that's something I will say that people I think underestimate, that they think like, oh, this work, everyone can do everything. But you all are gifted classroom educators. And I would say you want someone who's been a K through 12 educator who can speak that language and knows what it's like to have to experience like classroom management. I know it's a thing, but I've never had to do that. Right. And so, yeah, there's strategic level work. I absolutely do with schools, school districts, boards, all of that to help them get the right framework. And then you want to call in these women to work with teachers directly. So thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone. If you would like to say thank you or bye in your home language, please.